Hey everyone, I'm Dread Whisper. Before you relax, like the video and subscribe. Where are you watching from and what time is it now? Get comfortable and drift into the darkness. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sarah began her usual night shift at Cedar Grove Hospital, the oldest medical facility in Lancaster County. Working as a nurse in the geriatric ward meant quiet nights, but this evening felt different. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, like the atmosphere before a severe storm. Her colleague Mark had called in sick, leaving her alone on the floor except for the occasional security guard rounds. The winter wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the century-old building. Sarah had worked at Cedar Grove for 15 years, starting as a fresh-faced graduate who still believed every medical situation had a logical explanation. Time had taught her otherwise. She'd seen things in this hospital that defied rational explanation, but she'd always managed to brush them aside, to focus on the practical aspects of her job. Tonight, however, something felt fundamentally wrong. As she settled into her station, organizing patient charts and checking medication schedules, she noticed something odd about the patient monitor for room 412, and Mrs. Henderson's vitals were perfectly normal. Too normal. The lines were completely steady, unlike the usual slight variations you'd see in even the most stable patients. After 15 years of nursing, Sarah knew that even sleeping patients showed some variation in their vital signs. The ward was unusually quiet tonight. Normally, there would be some ambient noise, the shuffle of patients with insomnia walking the halls, the whispered conversations of family members during extended visits, or the squeaking wheels of medication carts. But tonight, the silence was absolute, broken only by the steady beeping of monitors and the distant hum of the building's ancient heating system. Sarah pulled up Mrs. Henderson's digital chart on the computer. Everything seemed in order: medication times, nurse visits, doctor's notes. But something caught her eye. The room number, 412, had been reassigned multiple times over the past 15 years. In fact, no patient had stayed in that room for more than a few weeks before being transferred, or... Sarah's blood ran cold as she noticed a pattern. Many of the transfers had occurred under mysterious circumstances, often during night shifts. She grabbed her clipboard and headed down the dimly lit corridor, her footsteps echoing off the walls. The emergency lights cast long shadows that seemed to reach for her as she passed. As she approached room 412, the temperature dropped significantly. Her breath began to form small clouds in front of her face, and the metal nameplate on the door had accumulated a thin layer of frost, despite the heating system working overtime. Sarah checked her watch, 11:47 p.m. The security guard wouldn't make his rounds for another hour. She reached for the door handle, noticing how the metal felt unnaturally cold against her skin. The monitor inside continued to show those perfect, unchanging vitals, a mathematical impossibility that seemed to mock everything she knew about human physiology. Sarah pushed open the door to Mrs. Henderson's room, and her blood ran cold. The bed was empty, sheets undisturbed as if no one had ever laid there, but that was impossible. She checked on Mrs. Henderson just 2 hours ago during medication rounds. The patient monitor continued to beep steadily, its leads dangling in the air where they should have been attached to Mrs. Henderson's chest. The room felt wrong in ways Sarah couldn't quite explain. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should be, and the usual hospital smells of disinfectant and medication were replaced by something older, something that reminded her of dried flowers and stale earth. The window, despite being sealed shut since the building's last renovation, had a thin layer of black mold around its edges. Panic rising, Sarah rushed to check the bathroom. Empty. She grabbed her phone to call security, but there was no signal, unusual for the hospital, which had recently upgraded its cellular infrastructure. The computer at the nurse's station still showed Mrs. Henderson was checked in, vitals maintaining their impossible perfection. The time on the computer read 11:47 p.m., exactly the same as when she'd left the nurse's station, though she was sure several minutes had passed. As Sarah turned to leave the room, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. A figure in a hospital gown standing in the corner, the corner that had been empty just seconds ago. The figure remained perfectly still, its back turned to her, shoulders hunched in an unnatural position. The temperature dropped even further, and Sarah could see ice crystals forming on the window. "Mrs. Henderson?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but the shadows in the room seemed to pulse in response to her voice. The medical equipment began to malfunction, screens flickering with random numbers and patterns. Sarah took a step closer, her years of professional training warring with her instinct to run. As she approached, she realized with growing horror that the figure's feet weren't touching the ground. It hovered several inches above the floor, the hem of its hospital gown swaying in a non-existent breeze. The overhead lights began to flicker, and in the strobing effect, Sarah saw something that turned her blood to ice. Where the figure's shadow should have been, there were multiple shadows, each in a different position, like frames in a jerky film. Angrily, some showed the figure standing, others crouched, and some in positions that no human spine could achieve. The shadows moved independently of the figure, reaching across the floor towards Sarah's feet. The temperature plummeted further as the figure slowly turned. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. It wasn't Mrs. Henderson. The face was grotesquely distorted, with hollow black eyes that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the room. The skin was gray and mottled, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. A hoarse whisper filled the room. "They never found me." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing in Sarah's mind rather than her ears. The words carried decades of pain and anger, and as they faded, Sarah's mind was flooded with fragmented memories that weren't her own. Glimpses of Cedar Grove from years past, when the hospital still had a psychiatric ward in the basement. She saw flashes of restraints, heard screams echoing down tiled corridors, felt the desperation of someone fighting against hospital staff. Sarah backed away, but the door slammed shut behind her with enough force to crack the frame. The entity drifted closer, and suddenly Sarah remembered a case from 15 years ago, her first week at Cedar Grove. A patient had gone missing from the psychiatric ward, never to be found. The investigation had gone cold, but there had been rumors about room 412, whispers among the older staff about strange occurrences, about patients who claimed to see things in the night. The lights began to flicker violently, and through the strobing darkness, Sarah saw more figures emerging from the walls, other lost souls, all wearing hospital gowns from different eras, all bearing the same hollow eyes. They surrounded her, their whispers growing into a deafening chorus. "Join us, join us." Each spirit carried marks of their final moments, some with surgical scars, others with the signs of neglect from a darker time in medical history. The original entity reached out with a hand that seemed too long, fingers extending like shadows at sunset. Its touch left frost on Sarah's skin, and with that contact came more visions. She saw the truth of what had happened in room 4012 over the decades. The room had been used for experimental treatments in the 1950s, unauthorized procedures that the hospital had covered up. The spirits weren't just victims. They were witnesses seeking justice. As the entities closed in, Sarah's hand brushed against her cross necklace, a gift from her grandmother, who had once worked as a nurse in this very hospital. Her grandmother had always said it was blessed, had insisted Sarah wear it during night shifts. In desperation, she held it out, and the figures recoiled, their forms wavering like smoke in a strong wind. The temperature began to rise, and the lights stabilized momentarily. The main figure, the first patient, locked eyes with Sarah. In that moment of connection, Sarah understood what needed to be done. The spirit pointed to a specific spot beneath the window where the baseboards met the floor. Years of paint and renovations had hidden it, but there was something behind those walls. Sarah spent the rest of her shift documenting everything she had experienced, taking photographs of the frost patterns, the cracked door frame, and the mysterious black mold. When morning came, she presented her evidence to the hospital administrator, along with historical records she pulled from the hospital's archives. Records of missing patients, unusual deaths, and suspicious transfers, all connected to room 422-112. The police investigation that followed uncovered human remains dating back to the 1950s, hidden within the walls. Multiple bodies were found, each corresponding to unsolved missing persons cases. The evidence uncovered led to the exposure of decades of medical malpractice and cover-ups, forcing the hospital to acknowledge its dark past. Sarah submitted her transfer request to the day shift, but not before ensuring proper burial rites were performed for all the discovered remains. She attended each funeral, watching as families finally found closure for their long-lost loved ones. The hospital established a memorial garden in honor of the victims, and room 412 was permanently sealed off. In the years that followed, the geriatric ward underwent extensive renovation. The old room 412 was converted into a memorial space where families could come to remember their loved ones. The paranormal activities ceased, though staff would occasionally report hearing whispers of gratitude in the early hours of the morning. The patient monitors never showed those perfect, steady lines again, and the temperature remained normal. Sarah continued working at Cedar Grove, but only during daylight hours. She kept her grandmother's cross close, and on quiet afternoons she would visit the memorial garden. Sometimes, when the light hit the stained glass windows just right, she could swear she saw peaceful figures walking among the flowers, finally at rest. The hospital's dark history had been exposed, justice had been served, and the lost souls of room 412 had finally found their peace. Detective James Morrison stared at the phone records spread across his desk, illuminated by the dim glow of his office lamp. It was 2:47 a.m., and the Portland Police Department's Homicide Division was eerily quiet. The case file before him contained something impossible, something that had kept him awake for the past 3 nights. The victim, Sarah Chen, a 32-year-old software developer, had been found dead in her apartment last week. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. Nothing suspicious except for one detail that made Morrison's skin crawl. According to the phone records, Sarah had received a call at exactly 3:33 a.m. on the night of her death. The call lasted precisely 7 minutes and 13 seconds. The impossible part: the call came from her grandmother's phone number. Her grandmother, who had died 3 months ago. Morrison had already verified that the grandmother's phone had been disconnected and the number hadn't been reassigned. He'd checked with every carrier in the state. The number simply didn't exist anymore, yet there it was on the records, clear as day. But that wasn't even the strangest part. 2 days ago, another victim was found. Michael Torres, 45, an accountant with no connection to Sarah Chen. Same cause of death, same time of death, and the same thing in his phone records. A call at 3:33 a.m. lasting 7 minutes and 13 seconds from his dead wife's number. She had passed away 6 months ago in a car accident. Morrison pulled out his voice recorder, speaking quietly into it as he reviewed his notes. Their victims show no signs of struggle or trauma. Both bodies were found in locked apartments, security systems armed. Both victims were discovered sitting upright in chairs, phones in their hands. Preliminary toxicology reports show nothing unusual, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of foul play except... He paused, looking at the crime scene photos. Both victims wore expressions of absolute terror. The detective had interviewed the victims' families, colleagues, and friends. No one reported anything unusual in their behavior leading up to their deaths, except for one detail that kept surfacing. Both victims had mentioned hearing static on their phones in the days before their deaths. Not just any static. They described it as sounding like distant whisper. Morrison's own phone had started producing the same static 3 days ago. At first he'd dismissed it as network interference, but last night he could have sworn he heard words in the white noise. He'd been avoiding calls since then, letting everything go to voicemail, but he knew he couldn't keep that up forever. The office phone on his desk suddenly rang, making him jump. The caller ID showed only static, pixels randomly shifting and changing. Morrison checked his watch. 3:32 a.m. His heart began to race as he stared at the ringing phone. The sound seemed to change, becoming deeper, more distorted with each ring. The lights in his office began to flicker, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The ringing stopped abruptly at 3:33 a.m. For a moment, absolute silence filled the office. Morrison's breath came out in visible puffs of vapor despite the building's heating system. His cell phone, set to silent and tucked away in his desk drawer, lit up with an incoming call. The number displayed made his blood run cold. It was his mother's old number. She had passed away when he was just a teenager, 20 years ago. The phone screen flickered between the number and bursts of static. Each flash revealed fragments of what looked like a face in the static, becoming clearer with each pulse. The temperature continued to drop and frost began forming on the office windows. Morrison's hands shook as he reached for the drawer. Years of police training warred with primal fear as he pulled out the phone. The screen now showed a distorted image that looked like a woman's face, but wrong. The features were twisted, the eyes too dark and too wide. The face seemed to be pressing against the screen from the inside, like something trying to break through a membrane. The static coming from the phone grew louder, resolving into what sounded like hundreds of whispered voices speaking simultaneously. Morrison could almost make out words, phrases that seemed to repeat. Join us, see us, hear us. The voices carried a desperate, hungry quality that made his skin crawl. Pictures began flashing across his computer screen, crime scene photos from his old cases, but distorted. In each image, the victims' faces were replaced by the same twisted expression he'd seen on Sarah Chen and Michael Torres. The faces seemed to turn toward him, their mouths opening impossibly wide. His desk lamp began to strobe, and in the flickering light, Morrison saw something that defied reality. Shadows were peeling themselves off the walls, taking vaguely human shapes. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like footage from a broken film projector. Each shadow seemed to reach toward him with elongated fingers. The phone in Morrison's hand grew impossibly cold, frost spreading across its surface and onto his fingers. He tried to drop it but couldn't. His muscles wouldn't respond. The whispered voices became clearer, and with growing horror he recognized them. His mother's voice was there, along with the voices of victims from cases he'd worked over the years. The shadows continued to advance, and as they got closer, Morrison could see details in their darkness, faces and forms of people he knew were dead. Sarah Chen was there, her features twisted in that same expression of terror she'd worn when they found her. Michael Torres stood beside her, along with others Morrison recognized from old case files. Through the cacophony of whispers, his mother's voice became distinct. "Jimmy, we've missed you so much. We've been trying to reach you." The voice was almost right, almost the way he remembered it, but there was something wrong, a hollow quality, like the words were being spoken through a long, empty tunnel. Morrison's computer began cycling through police databases, pulling up cases of mysterious deaths from across the country. Each one followed the same pattern: calls from dead loved ones, static on phones, victims found with expressions of terror. The cases went back decades, but they'd never been connected because they crossed jurisdictions and the details seemed too fantastic to be real. The shadows had almost reached him now, and Morrison could feel their cold radiance. Each one carried memories. He could see flashes of their final moments, their terror, their realization of what was happening. He understood now why the victims had those expressions frozen on their faces. They had seen what he was seeing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of loneliness, of an endless void where they existed, of their need to bring others into their world. Morrison's mother's voice rose above the others. "It's time to come home, Jimmy. We've waited so long." The shadows began to merge, forming a dark vortex around him, and Morrison felt reality starting to tear at the edges. As the shadows closed in, Morrison's training kicked in. Years of detective work had taught him to look for patterns, and suddenly he saw it. The times, the duration of the calls, the static. They weren't random. He forced his frozen fingers to move, pulling up an old case file on his computer. There, in a witness statement from 1987, was the key. A description of an experimental telephone system that had been tested by a now-defunct tech company. The system was designed to enhance long-distance communications using new frequencies. The project had been shut down after test subjects reported hearing strange voices and experiencing vivid hallucinations. The company's research facility had been located in Portland, just blocks from where he sat. Morrison's fingers flew across his keyboard, searching for more information. The shadows pressed closer, their whispers becoming screams, but he forced himself to focus. The facility had been built on top of an old cemetery, and the test frequencies had somehow created a bridge between worlds. With trembling hands, Morrison reached for his police radio, analog, not digital. The shadows recoiled from its static burst as he switched it on. He quickly changed frequencies, matching the numbers he'd found in the old research files. The effect was immediate. The shadows began to dissipate, the whispers fading. The phone in his hand grew warm again, the frost melting away. The screen showed one final message before going dark. "Thank you for finding us." Morrison understood. The souls hadn't been malevolent. They'd been trapped, caught between frequencies, trying to reach out for help. In the days that followed, Morrison worked with the city's engineering department to install frequency dampeners around the old facility site. The mysterious phone calls stopped. The cases were closed, marked as solved, but with heavily redacted details. Sarah Chen and Michael Torres were the last victims. Their families were given closure, told a version of the truth that omitted the supernatural elements but provided peace. Morrison made sure their death certificates were amended, acknowledging they had helped solve a decades-old mystery. Morrison kept the analog radio on his desk, set to that specific frequency. Sometimes, late at night, he could hear fragments of voices through the static, not screaming now, but peaceful, like distant conversations. Occasionally, he caught what sounded like his mother's voice, saying, "Thank you." The void had been closed, the connection severed, and the lost souls had finally found their way home. He still worked late nights at his desk, but now, when his phone rang after midnight, it was only the normal calls that came with being a homicide detective. The static was gone, replaced by the ordinary sounds of a city at night. But Morrison never forgot what he'd learned, that sometimes the dead reach out, not to harm, but to ask for help, and that even the most impossible cases have solutions if you're willing to look deep enough. Marcus Chen hadn't wanted to take the night security job at Ravenwood Storage Facility, but after 6 months of unemployment, he didn't have much choice. The pay was good, suspiciously good, he'd thought, and the job seemed simple enough: monitor the security feeds, do hourly rounds, and make sure nothing disappeared from the climate-controlled storage units in the converted 1920S warehouse. The facility's manager, Mr. Harrison, had been oddly specific during the orientation. "The basement camera feeds sometimes glitch," he'd said, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes. "Don't worry about it. And whatever you see on camera 23, just log it and move on." Before Marcus could ask what he meant, Harrison had hurried away, leaving behind a ring of keys and a dated security manual. Now, 3 weeks into the job, Marcus sat in the fluorescent-lit security office, watching the wall of monitors. The basement cameras had been acting up more than usual tonight. Camera 16 kept showing strange light anomalies. Camera 19 had periodic moments of static where the timestamp would jump forward exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds. And camera 23, Marcus tried to avoid looking at that one. He wasn't sure what version it would be of to melt the chips when it went violated. 9 times out, he'd broken Harrison's cardinal rule during his first week investigating one of camera 23's glitches in person. The storage unit it monitored was listed as empty in the facility's records, yet the camera consistently showed a large shape covered by a white sheet. When Marcus had gone down to check, he'd found nothing but empty space. The camera feed, however, still showed the shrouded form. Tonight was different. The usual static and glitches were more frequent, and Marcus could swear he heard whispers coming through the ancient intercom system. The basement temperature readings were dropping rapidly, far below the climate control settings. He'd called maintenance, but they wouldn't arrive until morning. The time on his computer read 11:47 p.m. when camera 23's feed changed. The shrouded shape moved. Just slightly at first, a ripple in the sheet, but enough to make Marcus sit up straight in his chair. The movement continued, becoming more deliberate. The sheet began to rise, as if whatever was beneath it was standing up. Marcus watched, paralyzed, as a hand emerged from beneath the sheet. The fingers were impossibly long and pale with too many joints. The hand reached toward the camera, and for the first time Marcus noticed something in the unit's background. Rows of identical sheets, each covering similarly sized shapes. The security office phone rang, startling Marcus out of his paralysis. The caller ID showed Basement, Unit 23, a number that shouldn't exist. The ringing echoed strangely, seeming to come from both the phone and somewhere deep within the building. Each ring was accompanied by a flicker of the lights and a drop in temperature. On screen 23, the figure had fully risen, still mostly covered but impossibly tall, its head nearly touching the unit's 12-foot ceiling. More hands had emerged from beneath the sheet, each moving with unnatural fluidity. The other shapes in the background were beginning to stir as well. Marcus's training manual lay open on his desk, and a page suddenly flipped on its own, revealing a section he hadn't noticed before. The paper was yellowed with age, the typewritten text faded. Prater 23. In the event of full manifestation, activate the copper containment system. Use the original key only. Failure to contain the entities will result in a Class 4 breach. The phone continued to ring as Marcus frantically searched through the keyring Harrison had given him. Among the modern keys was a single copper key, green with age. The basement security feed showed more figures rising, their sheets falling away to reveal forms that hurt his eyes to look at, geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The temperature in the security office plummeted. Frost formed on the monitors, spreading outward from camera 23 screen. The other basement cameras began to show movement as well, shadows flowing like liquid between the storage units, converging on Unit 23. The ringing phone's sound distorted, becoming deeper, taking on a quality that made Marcus's teeth vibrate. Marcus grabbed the copper key and the manual, his hands shaking as he headed for the basement stairs. The lights flickered continuously now, and the whispers from the intercom had become a constant stream of unintelligible sounds. As he descended, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself was becoming dense. The basement corridor stretched before him, emergency lights casting red shadows that seemed to move independently of any objects. The temperature was well below freezing now, his breath coming out in thick clouds. Camera 23's feed played on his phone. He'd connected to it before leaving the office, showing the figures now fully risen, their true forms hidden by increasingly transparent sheets. He passed Unit 16, where the light anomalies had transformed into swirling patterns that reached out toward him like fingers. Unit 19's door vibrated, the metal rippling as if something on the other side was pressing against it. The timestamp on his phone jumped forward again, 3:17, exactly like the camera glitches. The manual's pages continued turning on their own, revealing more text. The entities were contained in 1,923 during the warehouse's construction. They cannot be destroyed, only contained. The copper containment system uses the building's original foundation as a binding circle. All other attempted materials have failed. Marcus reached Unit 23A's door and found it covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. The copper key grew warm in his hand, pulsing like a heartbeat. Through the door he could hear movement, the sound of many things shifting and sliding against each other. His phone showed the camera feed deteriorating. The figures had fully shed their sheets, revealing forms that existed in too many dimensions at once. Their movements left trails in reality itself, like tears in the fabric of space. More concerning were the shadows on the floor, flowing out from beneath the door, reaching for his feet. The copper key lined perfectly with the unit's lock, though no such lock had been visible moments before. As Marcus turned it, the symbols on the door began to glow with a deep copper light. The manual's pages settled on a final passage. The key must be turned 3 times left, 7 times right. The numbers are significant. They match the original containment dates. Understanding dawned as Marcus recalled the camera glitches. 3 minutes, 17 seconds. He turned the key according to the pattern, each turn accompanied by a sound like distant bells. The shadows at his feet recoiled, drawing back under the door. The whispers from the intercom rose to a fever pitch before cutting off abruptly. Through his phone, he watched the camera feed as lines of copper light appeared in the unit, forming complex geometric patterns. The entities reacted to the light, their impossible forms compressing, folding in on themselves. The sheets rose again, wrapping around them like cocoons. The temperature began to rise, and the symbols on the door faded back to normal. When it was over, Marcus found additional pages in the manual, hidden in a false cover. They contained records dating back to 1923, describing how the warehouse had been built specifically to contain entities discovered during an archaeological dig. The copper containment system had been designed by a group of physicists and occultists working together, using principles of both science and ancient magic. The records included a list of night guards who had come before him, each adding their own notes and observations. Some had lasted years, others only days. Many had added warnings and advice. Marcus understood now why Harrison had been so vague. Some things couldn't be explained, only experienced. He added his own entry to the manual that night, documenting what he'd seen and what he'd done. The camera feeds returned to normal, though camera 23 still showed the shrouded shapes, now peaceful and still. The maintenance request for the temperature issues was canceled. Marcus kept the night security job at Ravenwood storage facility. He developed a routine: check camera 23 first thing each shift, keep the copper key close, and add to the manual when necessary. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, he could hear faint whispers through the intercom, not menacing now, but almost like conversation. He learned to distinguish between normal camera glitches and true anomalies, between harmless manifestations and potential breaches. The pay wasn't just good, it was hazard pay, he realized. Each night guard who survived their first encounter received a significant raise. Marcus used his to take night classes in physics and comparative mythology. He had a feeling both would be useful in his new career as a guardian of things that existed just beyond the edge of reality. Route 43 stretched endlessly through the Nevada desert, a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through the moonlit landscape. Emily Parker gripped her steering wheel tightly, fighting fatigue as her headlights illuminated the empty road ahead. The digital clock on her dashboard read 2:17 a.m. She'd been driving for 14 hours straight, determined to reach Las Vegas by morning. Her radio had stopped working 3 hours ago, around the same time she'd lost cell service. The silence was getting to her, broken only by the hum of her car's engine and the rhythmic sound of tires on pavement. She hadn't seen another vehicle since passing through the last small town, which her map showed as Shadowvale, population 157. The town had been strange. The few buildings she'd seen looked abandoned, yet she could have sworn she saw faces in the windows, watching her pass. The gas station attendant had warned her not to stop along Route 43 at night, especially not for hitchhikers. Some folks who stop, he'd said, his weathered face serious, they never reach Vegas. Emily had dismissed his warning as small-town superstition, but now, with nothing but desert and darkness surrounding her, his words kept repeating in her mind. The moonlight cast strange shadows across the landscape, and the rock formations seemed to shift and change shape in her peripheral vision. Her headlights flickered briefly, making her heart skip. She'd just had the car serviced before leaving San Francisco, specifically for this trip. The lights stabilized, but now they seemed dimmer somehow, as if the darkness was becoming more dense, more resistant to illumination. A road sign appeared ahead, Las Vegas, 217 miles. Below it, someone had spray-painted a message in red: "Don't pick them up." The paint looked fresh, gleaming in her headlights. As she passed the sign, her car's temperature gauge dropped suddenly, despite the desert heat. That's when she saw the figure standing by the roadside. Just a dark silhouette at first, thumb extended in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. As she got closer, her headlights revealed more details. A man in dated clothes, perhaps from the 1950 SS, with a small suitcase at his feet. He smiled as her car approached, but something about that smile made Emily's skin crawl. Emily's foot instinctively moved to the brake pedal before she remembered the gas station attendant's warning. She forced herself to maintain speed, knuckles white on the steering wheel as she prepared to pass the hitchhiker. But as she drew closer, her car began to sputter and slow, the engine dying despite her desperate attempts to keep it running. The vehicle rolled to a stop 30 feet past the hitchhiker. The car raced to 20 feet past the hitchhiker, and Emily turned the key repeatedly, but the engine wouldn't catch. The temperature inside the car plummeted, her breath forming visible clouds in the air. In her rearview mirror, she could see the hitchhiker walking toward her car, his movements too smooth, as if he was gliding rather than walking. Her doors locked themselves with a simultaneous click that made her jump. The hitchhiker's reflection in her side mirror seemed wrong, his features constantly shifting, his smile too wide for a human face. His suitcase scraped along the ground, leaving trails in the desert sand that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The radio suddenly crackled to life, playing fragments of songs from different decades: 50s rock and roll, 60s folk, 70s disco, interspersed with static and what sounded like distorted voices. Through the interference, she could make out phrases: "Help me," "Picked him up," "Never made it," "Route 43. Emily's phone lit up despite the lack of service, showing a series of text messages from unknown numbers. Each one contained the same warning: "Don't let him in." The timestamps on the messages spanned decades, the earliest dating back to 1954. A soft tapping on her window made her freeze. The hitchhiker stood outside her door, still smiling that impossible smile. His features were clearer now, too clear, as if he was in full daylight despite the darkness. His eyes reflected her headlights like an animal's, but with colors that shouldn't exist. "Need a ride?" the hitchhiker asked, his voice echoing strangely, as if coming from multiple directions at once. His breath didn't fog in the cold air, and his shadow stretched toward her car like a liquid seeping under the doors. Emily's heart raced as she noticed more details that her mind struggled to process. The hitchhiker's suitcase was weathered and covered in travel stickers, but the stickers showed impossible destinations and dates yet to come. The hitchhiker's door opened on the first step, and a light shone, like the door to destinations where dates yet to come. His clothes, while styled from the 1950s, seemed to shift between different eras when she wasn't looking directly at them. The radio continued its temporal journey through music history, but now she could hear clear voices between the songs. They were testimonies, she realized, stories from other drivers who had encountered this figure on Route 43. Their accounts spanned decades, each ending with the same chilling detail: they had let him in. Her phone cycled through more messages, showing photos now. Each one showed the same hitchhiker with different drivers in different cars across different years. In every photo, the driver's face was blurred, but their expressions were clear enough: terror frozen in time. The temperature dropped further as the hitchhiker's shadow began seeping through the car's ventilation system, filling the interior with an oily darkness that moved with purpose. The dashboard lights flickered and displayed impossible readings: negative miles, reversed timestamps, coordinates that couldn't exist. "You can't just leave me here," the hitchhiker said, his voice taking on a multi-tonal quality that made Emily's teeth ache. "I've been trying to get to Vegas for so long. So many rides, so many drivers, but never quite making it." His smile widened further, revealing too many teeth arranged in geometric patterns that hurt as the hitchhiker's shadow filled her car. Emily noticed something in the glow of her phone's screen, a pattern in the text messages. Each driver who had survived mentioned the same thing: the hitchhiker couldn't enter a vehicle unless invited. Like a vampire from old stories, he needed permission to cross the threshold. She also noticed something about her car's electrical system. The power wasn't dead. It was being suppressed. The hitchhiker's presence was like a dampening field, affecting anything electronic. But older technology, analog systems, seemed resistant. Emily's hand moved to her gear shift. Her car was new, but she'd insisted on learning to drive stick shift, much to her father's amusement. Sometimes the old ways are better, he'd said. Now, as she gripped the shifter, she understood why. Using the car's momentum and the slight decline of the road, she popped the clutch. The engine turned over, fighting against the hitchhiker's influence. The figure outside her window flickered, his form becoming less stable. His smile faltered for the first time. "You can't leave," he said, his voice distorting further. "No one leaves." But Emily could hear fear in his multi-toned voice now. She turned the key again, pumping the clutch. The engine roared to life, and the hitchhiker's shadow retreated from the vents like smoke in a wind. Emily slammed the accelerator, and her car shot forward. In her rearview mirror, she saw the hitchhiker's form dissolve into a swirl of temporal energy, revealing his true nature. A being of pure chronological chaos, feeding off the linear time of his victims. The radio cleared, playing a single clear message through the static. "Thank you." It was another driver's voice, one of the many who had encountered the hitchhiker over the decades. More voices joined in, a chorus of the saved, as the entity's hold over Route 43 began to break. Dawn was breaking as Emily reached the outskirts of Las Vegas. She pulled into the first gas station she saw and asked for directions to the nearest police station. The officers listened to her story with surprising attention, then showed her a wall of missing persons photos, drivers who had vanished on Route 43 since the 1956th. A request for forgery that dates to the alphabet soup. Over the next few weeks, the missing drivers began to reappear, each having aged only a few hours despite years or decades having passed. They were found along Route 43, confused but alive, their vehicles appearing alongside them, pristine despite the passage of time. The hitchhiker was never seen again, but the gas station attendant in Shadowvale added Emily's story to his collection. He still warns drivers about Route 43, but now he includes a new detail, how a young woman with a manual transmission car broke a time-eating entity's decades-long hold on the highway. Emily still drives stick shift, and she keeps her old analog watch even though it sometimes runs backward near Shadowvale. Some nights she swears she can hear thank you messages through her car radio. Voices of drivers she helped free from a temporal trap on a dark desert highway. The Chicago Central Station stood empty at 11:47 p.m., save for Thomas Wilson and his worn leather suitcase. The ancient building's restoration had been halted months ago, leaving it in a strange limbo between past and present. Modern digital displays hung alongside original brass fixtures, and temporary construction barriers created maze-like detours through marble-columned hallways. Thomas checked his ticket again, train 2/251 to Detroit, departing at midnight. The ticket had come in the mail 3 days ago, though he couldn't remember ordering it. It was printed on thick yellowed paper that felt too old for the current date stamped on it. He'd called the railway company to verify it, but their records showed no train 251 in their system. Yet here he was, drawn to the station by an inexplicable certainty that he needed to be here. The station's grand clock ticked loudly in the silence, its echoes bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. Thomas noticed something odd about its movement. The minute hand seemed to shudder between ticks, as if struggling against its own mechanism. The few other clocks visible through the construction tarps showed different times, despite the station's famous synchronization system. A security guard passed by, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Thomas raised his ticket, but the guard walked past without acknowledging him, as if he wasn't there. The beam of light passed right through Thomas's body, and he felt a cold shock of realization. He couldn't remember how he'd gotten to the station. The ticket in his hand grew warm, and the text began to change as he watched. The destination morphed from Detroit to final stop, and the date flickered between different years. Through the nearest window, he saw lights approaching. A train, but something was wrong with its proportions. It was too tall, too dark, and moved with an unnatural smoothness. Over the station's ancient PA system, a voice crackled. Now arriving on platform 13, train 251-2. Destinations unknown. All passengers please have your tickets ready. The voice sounded distorted, as if being played backward and forward simultaneously. Platform 13 didn't exist according to the station maps, but Thomas felt himself being drawn toward the far end of the building, where construction barriers blocked off an abandoned section. The barriers moved aside on their own as Thomas approached, revealing a previously hidden platform extending into darkness. The platform's architecture was different from the rest of the station, older, with designs that made his eyes hurt if he looked at them too long. The air felt thick, like walking through invisible cobwebs. Train 251 pulled into the station silently, its black metal surface absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The cars were a mix of different eras. Some appeared to be from the 1800s, others looked futuristic, and some seemed to flicker between states. Every window was dark, but Thomas could see movement behind them. The train's doors opened with a sound like sighing. Inside, the cars were lit by gas lamps that burned with blue flames. The seats were empty, but personal belongings were scattered throughout, bags, coats, and books that passengers had apparently left behind. A newspaper on one seat bore the date April 15, 1923, its pages crisp as if printed yesterday. Thomas's ticket burned hotter in his hand, and new text appeared beneath the destination. No returns. All times possible. The train's conductor appeared at the door of the nearest car. He wore a uniform that constantly shifted between different railway companies and eras, his face hidden beneath a cap that cast impossible shadows. "Ticket, please," the conductor said, his voice echoing as if speaking from the bottom of a well. As Thomas held out his ticket, he noticed other passengers appearing on the platform, transparent figures from different time periods, all holding similar yellowed tickets. They moved toward the train with jerky, mechanical motions, like automatons or figures in an old film. The conductor's gloved hand took Thomas's ticket, leaving frost on his fingers. "Car 7, the conductor said. "Mind the gaps between times." The other passengers were boarding now, each directed to different cars. Thomas noticed that they became more solid as they entered the train, while the world outside the windows became increasingly transparent. Car 7 was different from what he'd seen through the windows. The interior seemed to expand impossibly, with corridors that bent at non-Euclidean angles. The gas lamps cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. Each compartment he passed showed scenes from different years, some from the past, others from what appeared to be the future. In one compartment, a family in Victorian clothing sat frozen in mid-conversation. In another, a woman in futuristic attire worked on a holographic display. Each scene was perfectly preserved, like exhibits in a museum of time. Thomas realized with growing horror that these weren't scenes at all. They were moments, captured and held static like insects in amber. The conductor's voice echoed through the car. "Please take your assigned seat. The train will be departing old times shortly." Thomas found his compartment marked with his ticket number. Inside, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Himself, sitting by the window, but older. The other Thomas turned and smiled, his eyes reflecting the blue gas flames. His doppelganger spoke. "I've been waiting for you. For me, for us. The loop needs to be completed." The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Through the window, Thomas could see the station dissolving, revealing a void filled with twisted tracks that ran in impossible directions, connecting different points in time and space. Understanding dawned as memories began to surface, memories of other rides on train 251, of other loops through time, Thomas wasn't just a passenger, he was part of the train's eternal journey. Each version of himself had boarded at a different point in time, all working towards some cosmic convergence. The older Thomas held out a conductor's pocket watch. "It's your turn to complete the circle," he said. "Take it. Become the conductor for the next cycle. Help gather the lost moments, the forgotten times, the abandoned possibilities." The watch felt alive in Thomas's hand, ticking with the combined heartbeats of countless temporal variations. As he accepted the watch, the older Thomas began to fade, his time loop complete. The conductor's uniform materialized on Thomas, and with it came knowledge. Understanding of the train's true purpose. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a collector of lost time, a preserver of moments that had slipped through the cracks of reality. Through his new awareness, Thomas could see the train's full route, a Mobius strip through time itself, gathering passengers who had become unstuck from their proper moments. Some were accidents of temporal physics, others were souls who had lost their way between seconds. The train gave them all a home, a place where all times existed simultaneously. Thomas took his place at the front of the train, watching as the void of unclaimed time swirled around them. He could see other trains out there, other versions of Train 251, each with its own conductor, its own collection of moments. They acknowledged each other as they passed, guardians of temporal order. The train continued its endless journey, picking up passengers from different eras, preserving moments that would otherwise be lost. Thomas learned to read the tickets, to see the destinies written between their lines. Some passengers would disembark at their original times, their temporal displacement corrected. Others would become part of the train's eternal crew, helping to maintain the delicate balance of time. Years or moments later, time was fluid here. Thomas found himself back at Chicago Central Station, watching as a confused man with a leather suitcase examined a yellowed ticket. He smiled, knowing the loop would continue, the cycle unbroken. The train whistle sounded across all possible times, calling to those who had lost their place in the flowing river of moments. In the restored section of the station, modern trains continued their mundane journeys across physical distances. But in the shadows between seconds, Train 251 carried on its more vital work, gathering, preserving, and sometimes releasing the lost moments that kept time itself from unraveling. Rachel had always been a light sleeper. Moving to the suburbs was supposed to be her escape from the chaos of the city. Her new home, nestled at the edge of a dense forest, promised tranquility and a fresh start after her divorce. The house itself was charming in its way, with creaky wooden floors and large windows overlooking the snowy backyard. Yet there were moments when the silence felt oppressive, as though the house were waiting for something to disturb it. It was a frigid December night. Snow had fallen steadily throughout the day, leaving a thick, pristine blanket across the yard. Rachel sat curled up on her couch, sipping chamomile tea. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of the TV, where an old black and white movie played in the background. Midnight was approaching, and she knew she should head to bed soon. But the unease she'd been feeling all evening kept her rooted in place. Her phone vibrated on the coffee table, pulling her attention. A text from her friend Emily lit up the screen. "How's the new place? Settling in okay?" Rachel typed a quick reply, assuring her friend that everything was fine. But as she hit send, a faint noise drew her focus away. Tap, tap, tap. It was so soft she almost didn't hear it. At first she thought it might be her imagination. The wind, perhaps? A branch brushing against the side of the house? She muted the TV and sat perfectly still. Tap, tap, tap. This time there was no mistaking it. The sound was coming from the back of the house near the kitchen window. Her pulse quickened. Rachel rose cautiously, her bare feet padding softly on the wooden floor. The kitchen was dark except for the faint glow of the snow outside. She approached the window but kept a safe distance, peering out from the side. There was nothing there. Just the yard, empty and still under the moonlight. She exhaled, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Get a grip, Rachel," she muttered, turning back toward the living room. But as she reached the doorway, the tapping came again, louder this time. Her breath hitched. She spun around, her eyes locking on the kitchen window. A shadow moved, just barely visible at the edge of the frame. Rachel froze, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run, but she couldn't move, her feet rooted to the floor as her mind raced through possibilities. Who could be out there? Her nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and the only road leading to her house was barely drivable in this weather. Gathering her courage, she edged closer to the window. The shadow was gone. Her hands trembled as she reached for the light switch. She flipped it on, illuminating the backyard with a harsh yellow glow. The yard was empty, no footprints, no sign of anyone. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Determined to reassure herself, Rachel grabbed her phone and opened the security app linked to the cameras she'd installed around the property. The feed from the backyard camera showed nothing unusual. She switched to the front yard view, and her heart sank. A single set of footprints trailed from the woods to her front porch. Her stomach churned as she stared at the screen. The prints were fresh, the snow around them undisturbed. Rachel's mind struggled to rationalize what she was seeing. Maybe it was a delivery person? But at this hour? And why would they come through the wood? A loud thud jolted her out of her thoughts. It came from the front door. Rachel's phone slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor. She spun around, her eyes darting to the door. The sound came again, heavy and deliberate, as though someone were pounding their fist against the wood. Rachel's breathing quickened. She crept toward the door, her fingers trembling as she reached for the curtain beside the window. Peeking through, she saw nothing but the dimly lit porch. Still, the noise persisted, steady, unyielding, and almost mocking. Each pound felt like a challenge, daring her to confront whatever was outside. Her phone buzzed on the floor, breaking her trance. She grabbed it and dialed her friend Emily. The call rang twice before Emily's groggy voice answered. "Rachel? What's wrong?" "There's someone outside," Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. "They're knocking on the door, but I can't see anyone." Emily's voice sharpened with concern. "Lock your doors and call the police. I'm on my way." Rachel nodded, even though Emily couldn't see her. She ended the call and locked the door, double-checking the other entrances. But the unease lingered, gnawing at her as the knocking stopped abruptly. The silence was almost worse. Rachel's heart pounded as she crept toward the door again. She knew she should call the police, but a morbid curiosity compelled her to look first. She leaned forward, her eye pressing against the peephole. What she saw made her blood run cold. A figure stood on the porch, but it wasn't like any person she'd ever seen. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face was obscured by the shadows of the porch overhang, but its eyes glinted in the faint light, unblinking and fixed on the door. Rachel stumbled back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The pounding on the door stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling, as she dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to Rachel's panicked whispers as she described what was happening. "Stay on the line, man. Officers are on their way," the operator assured her. But Rachel wasn't convinced she had that kind of time. The sound of crunching snow drew her attention back to the front door. The figure was moving now, stepping off the porch and circling the house. She could hear its deliberate footsteps, slow and methodical, as it passed each window. Rachel ran to the living room, her eyes darting to the front window. The figure stopped, its head tilting as though it sensed her watching. Rachel dropped to the floor, clutching the phone to her chest. Her mind raced. What was it? Why was it here? The sense of dread grew heavier with each passing second. A sudden crash came from the backyard. Rachel's eyes widened as she realized the figure was now at the sliding glass door. It stood there, staring into the house, its unnatural grin visible under the pale moonlight. The door was locked, but Rachel knew it wouldn't hold if the thing wanted to get in. Rachel's eyes flicked to the security feed on her phone. The figure stood in the backyard, staring directly into the camera. Its features were distorted, as though its face were pressed against an invisible barrier. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its grin stretched impossibly wide. "Man, officers are less than 5 minutes away," the 911 operator said. "Stay where you are and don't make any noise." But Rachel couldn't stay still. The figure moved again, its steps crunching loudly in the snow as it approached the glass door. Rachel's pulse quickened as she watched it raise a hand and tap. Once, twice, against the glass. The sound of sirens shattered the tension. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as police cars pulled into the driveway. The figure didn't move. It stood there for a moment longer, then turned and vanished into the woods. The officers searched the property but found no trace of the intruder, only the footprints that circled the house. They assured Rachel they would patrol the area and suggested she stay with someone for the night. But as they left, one officer lingered. "Ma'am," he said hesitantly, "those footprints, they started and ended in the woods, but there's no sign of them leading away. It's like whoever it was just disappeared." Rachel didn't sleep that night. Even now, she can't shake the feeling that the figure wasn't trying to get in. It simply wanted her to know it was there. Selling the plot, Perry Lobster finally relocated to Mars. Within the compound, he finally found her. It all began one chilly autumn evening. Emily had just moved into her new apartment, a small, cozy place tucked in a quiet neighborhood at the edge of the woods. The building was old, but the rent was cheap, and after a stressful year, she wanted nothing more than peace. Little did she know, the peace she craved would soon turn into a nightmare. On her first night in the apartment, Emily settled into bed after unpacking the last of her boxes. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp beside her, casting long shadows against the walls. She'd always been a light sleeper, so when the clock struck midnight, she woke up, unsettled by an odd sensation. A slight chill ran down her spine as she noticed something strange. The shadows in her room seemed to shift, subtly but undeniably. At first, she chalked it up to the wind, the way it moved the curtains and distorted the light. But then she heard something. A soft whisper, almost inaudible, came from the direction of the bedroom door. "Emily?" Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't imagining it. The voice was clear. It was calling her name. The air in the room felt thick, as if something invisible was pressing down on her. She lay frozen in her bed, trying to reason with herself. Maybe it was the house settling. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But then the whisper came again, louder this time. "Emily, it's time!" The darkness seemed to swell, and her breath became shallow. She pulled the covers tightly over her head, hoping to block out whatever presence had invaded her room. But the whispers didn't stop. Instead, they grew in intensity, almost as if they were closing in on her, surrounding her from every corner of the room. Terrified, Emily leapt out of bed and flicked on the light, but the room was empty. The shadows remained still, and the air felt less oppressive. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears as she stood frozen in place, trying to process what had just happened. It was just her imagination, right? She turned to the door, the one that seemed to be the source of the whispers. It was slightly ajar. As she approached, a cold gust of wind swept through the crack and she gasped, quickly slamming the door shut. For the rest of the night, the whispers ceased, and Emily tried to convince herself that it had been some sort of hallucination from stress. But as she lay back in bed, her eyes locked on the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to linger longer than usual. The whispers had stopped for now, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. The next day, Emily went about her routine, trying to ignore the events of the previous night. She chalked it up to exhaustion or the stress of moving, but as the day wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she entered a room, she felt like someone or something was just out of sight, waiting. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the city, Emily decided to take a walk to clear her head. The neighborhood was peaceful, with leaves swirling in the cool autumn breeze. But when she returned to her apartment building, a strange sight caught her eye. A man in a dark coat stood outside the building, staring up at her window. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his eyes seemed to glow faintly, fixed on her like a predator watching its prey. Shivering, she quickly turned away and entered the building, locking the door behind her. Her mind raced with confusion and anxiety. Who was that man? Why was he staring at her apartment? Back in her apartment, she tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but the more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. The whispers from last night seemed to connect with a strange figure outside. Was he involved somehow? Was he the one responsible for the eerie presence she'd felt? As Emily prepared for bed later that night, she took a moment to inspect the room again. She had checked for any signs of an intruder earlier, but nothing had seemed out of place. The door was locked, the windows secured. Still, she couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. When she sat on the edge of her bed, she noticed something new. An object on the nightstand, just inches from where she'd left it. A small, weathered piece of paper, folded neatly in half. It read, "It's already inside. You can't escape. It wants you." A chill shot through her as her eyes scanned the words. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she dropped the note onto the floor. She looked around, her breath coming in shallow gasps. No one had been in the apartment except for her. The note, the whispers, the man outside. It was all connected. Just then, a loud knock echoed through the apartment door, making her jump out of her skin. Emily froze, staring at the door, heart pounding in her chest. The last time someone knocked at her door was the landlord, and that had been weeks ago. Who could it be? "Emily!" A voice called from the other side, just like the whisper from the night before. "Let me in." Her stomach dropped. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same one that had haunted her dreams. Frozen in place, Emily stood in the middle of the room, her heart thundering in her chest. The voice on the other side of the door was unmistakable. It had called her name just like it had the night before, but now there was something even more unsettling about it. It wasn't just the whisper. It was a command, an order. "Emily, let me in." She glanced toward the door, her mind racing. Who was it? Could it be the man she'd seen outside earlier? Or was it something else entirely, something darker, more malevolent? The knocking came again, this time louder, harder, as if the thing, on the other side was growing impatient. It sounded like fists slamming against the wood, each strike reverberating through her skull. Emily stumbled backward, her legs weak with fear. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift, darkening the corners, crawling along the walls like they were alive. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to approach the door, but her hand hovered over the handle, hesitant. Could she really open it? Could she face whatever was waiting outside? The whispering grew louder, more frantic, until it filled her ears, drowning out every other sound. "Let me in, Emily." With trembling hands, she opened the door. There was no one standing there. Her heart skipped a beat as she peered down the dimly lit hallway. The lights flickered overhead, casting brief shadows on the walls. The hall was empty. The air was thick with silence, and yet she felt it. The presence. It was in the room with her, just beyond her sight. Something was watching her, its unseen eyes studying her every move. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, causing her to stumble forward. Emily spun around in shock, but the room was unchanged. She was alone. Still, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, the shadows in the corner of the room stirred, taking form. At first, it was hard to make out, but then it became clear. A figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by darkness. It stood motionless, watching her. The air grew heavier with each passing second, and Emily's breath became shallow. The whispering began again, now louder than ever, coming from all directions. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The figure took a step forward, and Emily could feel the temperature drop. It was freezing, a bone-chilling cold that wrapped around her, making her skin prickle. The figure stepped closer, and Emily's legs buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body refused to move. The figure loomed above her, its shape becoming clearer, pale, gaunt, with eyes that burned like coals in the darkness. And then it spoke. Its voice not a whisper, but a low, guttural growl. "It's too late, Emily." She tried to scream, but the sound was trapped in her throat, her body paralyzed by terror. The shadows pressed in on her from all sides, closing her in. The figure's hand reached down, and Emily braced herself for whatever was coming next. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The room was silent again. The oppressive air lifted. Emily lay on the floor, trembling, unable to process what had just happened. Had it been real? Or was it just a hallucination? Her mind raced, trying to find an explanation for the terror she'd just experienced. She glanced around, and her gaze landed on the nightstand once more. The note was gone. Her breath hitched, and she quickly turned back to the door. It was locked. She hadn't unlocked it, had she? A cold breeze rushed through the room, carrying with it a faint whisper, this time clear as day. "Go to sleep, Emily." The words hung in the air, chilling Emily to her very core. "Go to sleep, Emily." The voice was no longer a whisper, but a command, an undeniable force that seemed to push against her will, urging her to comply. Her hands shook as she stared at the empty space where the figure had once stood. The silence that followed felt suffocating, thick with dread. She wanted to fight it. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape. But her body felt heavy, as though the very air around her was trying to hold her in place. Her eyes were heavy, struggling to stay open, as if something was pulling her toward sleep, toward the darkness. The last thing she saw before her vision blurred was the shadows in the corner of the room. Alive, moving, shifting in unnatural ways, bending and twisting in unnatural ways, bending and twisting in unnatural ways, bending and twisting in unnatural ways, bending, shifting in unnatural ways. They were closing in on her, gathering like a storm. "Sleep," the voice urged once more. It was closer now, just beside her ear, cold and breathless. She could feel its presence behind her, like a dark hand resting on her shoulder. Her eyelids fluttered, and her thoughts became a haze. She felt herself slipping away, her body no longer her own. It was as if she was falling into a void, a place where nothing existed but the whispers and the shadows. But as she succumbed to the darkness, a surge of panic jolted through her. She couldn't let this happen. Not now. Not like this. She tried to scream, to break free, but her voice was lost in the emptiness. The cold hand on her shoulder tightened, its grip unyielding. In the distance, she heard the faintest sound, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, and then it hit her. The sound of the door opening. It wasn't just any door. It was the front door to her apartment, the one that led out to the street. The door had opened without her touching it. The shadows recoiled, as though they were afraid of something. Emily's eyes snapped open. The apartment was quiet, empty. But she wasn't alone. A figure stood in the doorway, a man, tall, dark, with eyes like burning coals. His presence filled the room, casting an aura of finality around him. He didn't speak, but his gaze pierced through her, searching her very soul. The cold air in the room thickened again, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It was comforting, like the cold of a winter night, pure and still. The man stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the room, wrapping around Emily like a protective cloak. For the first time since she'd moved in, the fear that had gripped her heart seemed to dissipate. The figure didn't move toward her in aggression. He didn't threaten. He simply stood there, watching her with an intensity she couldn't explain. And then, as if sensing her confusion, the man spoke. "It's over now," he said, his voice calm. The shadows that had once filled the room began to retreat, fading away into the corners of the apartment, leaving the space eerily quiet and still. Emily blinked, her head spinning, unsure of what was real anymore. The whispers had stopped, the figure was gone, and the apartment, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed ordinary, safe. But as she lay there in the silence of her room, the unsettling thought crept into her mind. Was it truly over? Had she escaped the nightmare, or had she simply become part of it? She closed her eyes, too exhausted to think any longer. Sleep at last took her. And in the distance, beyond the walls of the apartment, the faintest whisper lingered on the wind. Emily will meet again. It was her birthday, and Lily had been looking forward to it for weeks. A quiet dinner with family, some time to relax, and of course, the presents. But there was one gift she didn't expect. It arrived in a small, unmarked box. No card, no name. Just the simple brown packaging that felt oddly heavy in her hands. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was an antique doll, its porcelain skin flawless, and its eyes eerily lifelike. It was dressed in a vintage lace dress, with a bonnet perched on its head. The doll's expression was blank, its gaze unsettling, as if it were watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Lily frowned. She didn't recognize the doll. No one in her family had mentioned buying it for her, and none of her friends had given it to her either. Her grandmother, however, was the only one who might have a connection to something like this. Her grandmother was fond of collecting antiques, especially dolls. Lily's first instinct was to call her, but when she picked up her phone, there was no answer. She set the doll on her nightstand and tried to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. After all, it was just a doll, right? Nothing more than an odd gift. But as she lay in bed later that night, the strange feeling lingered. There was something about its eyes. It was as if it could see into her soul, studying her every move. The room felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. Lily pulled the covers tighter around her, trying to ignore the discomfort. She had never been one to believe in superstition or the paranormal, but tonight, that doll made her question everything. As she drifted off to sleep, the house grew eerily quiet, too quiet. The usual hum of traffic outside, the creaks of the old house settling, the soft sound of wind against the windows. Everything was gone. Only the silence remained, thick and suffocating. The following morning, Lily tried to dismiss the unsettling thoughts about the doll. It was just a strange gift, nothing more. She left for work, leaving the doll on her nightstand, its blank stare following her departure. However, as soon as she returned home that evening, a strange feeling hit her. The air felt thicker, almost as if it were pressing in on her. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows against the walls. She paused at the door, a sense of unease settling in her chest. Something was off. When she stepped inside, she noticed the doll immediately. It was no longer positioned on the nightstand where she had left it. It was now sitting upright on the edge of her bed, staring at her with those unblinking, lifelike eyes. Lily's blood ran cold. She had never touched it after setting it down the night before. She had gone straight to bed and hadn't moved it. Had someone been in her apartment? She searched the entire place, but nothing seemed disturbed. Her door was locked. There were no signs of forced entry, yet the doll had moved. Of that she was certain. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a message from her grandmother, who had finally responded to Lily's call earlier that morning. I'm sorry, dear. I should have taken my commandment to overthrow. Life was easier. Marty, I'm sorry. I should have taken it. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the words, her mind racing. What did her grandmother mean by that? She had to get answers. She called her grandmother immediately, her hands shaking. When her grandmother answered, there was a tremor in her voice. Lily, I'm so sorry. I didn't think you'd receive it. That doll. It's an old family heirloom, but it's cursed. My grandmother gave it to me, and I kept it hidden all these years. When I was your age, I made the mistake of keeping it close. Strange things started happening. Shadows moved on their own. Doors creaked open at night. I heard whispers, felt cold hands on my shoulder when no one was there. Worst of all, the doll would change its position. I tried to get rid of it, but it always came back. Lily's heart pounded as her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. It was all too much to process. "What happened to it?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know." After a few weeks, the terror stopped. The doll disappeared from my life, and I thought it was over. But Lily, please don't keep it. It will find its way back. It will claim you. The call ended abruptly, leaving Lily in stunned silence. She stood frozen in the center of her living room, staring at the doll on her bed. Its lifeless gaze seemed even more intense now, almost accusatory. The room seemed to grow colder by the second. A strange sound echoed from the hallway, a soft scraping like nails dragging across wood. Lily's eyes darted to the door. The scratching continued, growing louder, as if something was dragging itself toward her. Lily stood frozen in the center of her living room, her mind racing. The sound of nails dragging across the wooden floor grew louder, drawing closer. She turned toward the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence of the apartment was now shattered by the eerie scraping, as if something or someone was moving in the darkness. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, wanting to call her grandmother again. But before she could dial, the scratching stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, as if the very air had thickened, pressing against her chest. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Her instinct told her to leave, to run far away from the apartment and never look back. But something deep inside her refused to let go of the mystery. Was the doll truly cursed? Was it connected to the strange happenings? She couldn't explain why, but she felt a compulsion to confront it, to figure out what was going on. Taking a deep breath, she turned back toward the bedroom. The doll still sat on her bed, its porcelain face as emotionless as ever. But its eyes seemed to follow her every movement, shifting ever so slightly, as if acknowledging her presence. The unsettling feeling crawled up her spine again, but Lily didn't flinch. She had to know the truth. As she stepped closer to the bed, the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath became visible in the air, a fine mist forming with every exhale. She glanced down at the doll, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch it. Before her fingers could make contact, a cold gust of wind slammed into her, sending her stumbling backward. The doll didn't move, but something behind it did. A dark shape appeared in the shadows of the room, shifting and contorting into an unnatural form. Lily's heart raced, her body frozen with fear as the figure slowly took shape. It was a shadow, but not just any shadow. This one was tall, featureless, and moved with a grotesque jerking motion, as if its limbs didn't bend naturally. The air was thick with a low, vibrating hum, as though the very walls of the room were resonating with something sinister. Lily wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to the door, but the hallway was empty. The door was shut tight. There was nowhere to go. The shadow began to move toward her, its form becoming clearer with each step. But it never quite revealed its face. Instead, it radiated an overwhelming sense of dread, as if it were an embodiment of pure malice. It was drawn toward the doll, its movements jerking closer with every passing second. Lily took a step back, her body finally obeying her fear. She reached for the door, but before she could touch the handle, the shadow lunged. Her breath caught as a cold, clammy hand gripped her wrist, pulling her back. It felt like ice, and the moment it touched her skin, a wave of terror surged through her. Her vision blurred, her thoughts scattered, and for a brief moment she lost all sense of time. But then the hand released her. She gasped, stumbling forward. The shadow, the presence that had been so close, retreated, and with it the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The room grew warmer, the chill vanishing in an instant. The scratching noise that had filled the air was gone. Lily turned to face the bed, her heart still racing in her chest. The doll sat exactly where it had been, motionless, unblinking. But something had changed. The room no longer felt haunted by an unseen presence, and for a moment, it almost felt like nothing had happened at all. But Lily knew better. The curse wasn't over. It had only just begun. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The calm that had settled over the room didn't reassure her. It terrified her. It was too quiet, too still. She was trapped in her own apartment, the doll's lifeless gaze watching her every move. She glanced at the window, hoping for a glimpse of the outside world, but the dark sky only deepened her sense of isolation. The world beyond her walls felt distant and unreachable, as if she had been cut off from reality itself. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, "It will claim you." The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The doll wasn't just an object. It was a vessel, a conduit for something far darker than she could comprehend. The shadow, the coldness, the strange force that had gripped her wrist, it was all connected to the doll. Lily's pulse quickened as she approached the bed. Unable to resist the pull any longer, she reached for the doll again. This time with more determination, her fingers brushed the cold porcelain, and as they did, the room seemed to constrict, the walls pressing in, the air growing heavier by the second. The moment her hand touched the doll, a sharp, agonizing pain shot through her arm, like something was pulling at her very soul. She gasped, but no sound escaped her lips. The world around her flickered, darkness and light warred in her vision, and the room twisted as though reality itself was warping. The doll's eyes gleamed brighter than before, its empty stare now filled with malice. The presence in the room grew stronger, more oppressive, as if it were feeding off her fear. The coldness returned, but now it was accompanied by a strange humming sound, low, resonant, like an incantation being whispered in a language older than time. Lily wanted to let go of the doll, to pull her hand away, but something held her in place. She was no longer in control. Her body was moving on its own, as though some dark force was guiding her actions. Her fingers tightened around the doll, and the humming grew louder. "Lily," a voice rasped, low and echoing, as though it were coming from the depths of the earth itself. The words crawled beneath her skin, a cold chill running through her veins. "You should have left." The voice wasn't her grandmother's, but it was familiar in an unnerving way. It was the same voice that had whispered to her when the shadows had first appeared. It was everywhere, vibrating through the walls, seeping into her mind. Her vision blurred again, and in that haze she saw it. An image of her grandmother, but twisted, distorted. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, and in her hands she held the same cursed doll, its eyes gleaming with sinister light. "No," Lily whispered, struggling to break free from the grip of the doll. "No, this can't be happening." The vision of her grandmother faded, replaced by the shadow from earlier, the one that had haunted her, pursued her. It was now towering over her, its featureless face inches from her own. The air felt suffocating, the darkness pressing against her like an insurmountable weight. Suddenly, the doll in her hands felt heavier, as though it had become a burden far beyond her strength. She could feel its power surging through her, dark and insidious. It was draining her, stealing her will. With everything she had left, Lily slammed the doll down onto the ground, her breath ragged. The room went silent. The cold lifted, the air cleared. For a moment she thought it was over. The doll lay still at her feet, its eyes no longer glowing, its form no longer a sinister presence. But as she took a step back, the ground beneath her trembled. The doll didn't remain still. It rolled onto its back, and then, like a puppeteer's string being pulled, it slowly began to rise, as if it were alive. Its head turned toward her, and its eyes burned with a dark fire. Lily backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, no, no!" The shadows in the room grew longer, more pronounced, and the doll, it began to laugh. A soft, sinister giggle that echoed in the silence, building to a shrill, mocking sound. The laughter grew louder, as if it were coming from all directions at once. It was no longer the doll. It was something else, something far older, far darker. Lily stumbled toward the door, but it wouldn't open. The shadows had come alive, creeping along the walls, sealing her in. She turned back toward the doll, her mind racing, but it was no use. It was too late. The curse had claimed her, and now she would never be free. Rachel had just moved into her new apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit on the third floor of an older building in a quiet part of town. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The walls were a bit thin, and the floors creaked underfoot, but that was to be expected with a place that had been built decades ago. Despite a few imperfections, it felt like a fresh start after a tumultuous year. She spent the first few days unpacking, setting up her furniture, and adjusting to the silence of the apartment. It was strange being alone after so long. She'd always had roommates before, but this time it was different. There was a stillness that seemed to seep into the very walls, a kind of energy that Rachel couldn't quite place. The neighbors were quiet too, the only sounds coming from the occasional footstep or muffled conversation. One evening, after a long day of work, Rachel collapsed onto the couch, exhausted. She glanced around her new living room, taking in the simplicity of the space. The light from the street lamp outside filtered through the curtains, casting faint shadows across the room. It was peaceful, or so it seemed. As she sat there, sipping her tea, she couldn't help but notice something odd. In the far corner of the room, near the window, the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. The shape didn't look quite right. At first she assumed it was just a trick of the light, but then she saw it again. Something darker, something moving ever so slightly. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She blinked and looked away, trying to calm her racing thoughts. It was probably just the wind, the curtains moving slightly. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave her. She felt as though she wasn't alone in the room anymore. Shaking off the unease, she went to bed, convincing herself that it was nothing. But as she lay in the dark, just as she was about to drift off, she saw it again. Just a flicker at the corner of her vision. The shadow had moved, and this time, it wasn't just a trick of the light. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Rachel couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the shifting shadow in the corner of her living room flashed before her mind. It was an unsettling presence, like a cold breath against her skin, invisible yet so tangible. She tried to dismiss it as her imagination, the result of stress from the move and her busy work schedule. But the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and persistent. The next day, after another exhausting shift at the office, Rachel decided to tackle the odd sensation head-on. She had to know if there was something actually there, something that was making her feel so uneasy. Armed with a flashlight, she stood in the middle of the living room, scanning the corners, one by one. The space felt unnervingly still. The air, thick with tension, didn't seem to move at all. The shadows in the room were long and dark, but nothing appeared out of place. There was no figure, no shape lurking in the corner. Rachel sighed in relief, trying to convince herself that it had just been her mind playing tricks. But as she turned to leave the room, she saw it again. The faintest flicker in the corner of her eye. It was subtle, but it was there. The shape in the corner shifted once more, slowly, as though it were becoming aware of her presence. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart began to race as she felt the cold weight of something watching her. The shadow moved again, this time more definitively. A shape, humanoid, tall, emerged from the darkness. Rachel's hands trembled as she took a hesitant step forward, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand. But as soon as she stepped closer, the shadow seemed to shrink back, retreating into the corner, vanishing from sight as though it had never been there at all. She blinked, her heart pounding, the flashlight now shining only on an empty corner. Rachel turned and walked away, trying to rationalize what she'd just seen. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, "just shadows." But the discomfort remained, gnawing at her, and the fear grew stronger by the hour. That night, as she lay in bed again, her eyes wide open, she could hear the faintest noise, a soft, dragging sound coming from the living room. At first, she thought it was just the wind again, or maybe the old building settling. But then, the sound came again. It was slow, deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving around the room. Rachel's pulse quickened. She reached for her phone, but it was too far away. The sound continued, growing louder, closer. She took a deep breath and forced herself to get up. Every part of her body screamed for her to stay put, to pull the covers over her head and pretend it was all a bad dream. But something inside her urged her to confront whatever was making the noise. With her heart in her throat, she stepped out into the dark hallway, clutching her phone as if it could somehow protect her. The apartment was eerily quiet, the shadows longer now, stretching across the floor. The sound had stopped, but the heavy silence felt even worse. She reached the living room door, her hand trembling as she pushed it open. And there, in the corner, just beyond the light, the shape was there again. It stood motionless, but Rachel could feel the presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest as she stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the corner of the room. The shape was there, but now it was more defined. It was no longer just a vague shadow. There was something human-like about it. A tall, slender form, its edges blurring and stretching as if it were made from darkness itself. The figure seemed to breathe with the room, expanding and contracting with each shift of the air. A cold chill crawled up Rachel's spine, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the shape. It wasn't moving, but it was far from still. The darkness seemed to pulse and undulate as though it were alive in a way that made her blood run cold. The sound of the dragging movement returned, and this time it was unmistakable. The figure shifted, its silhouette moving closer to her, impossibly fast, as if it had been waiting for her to make the next move. Rachel stumbled backward, her breath shallow, her legs refusing to support her. She hit the wall, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. Suddenly, the figure's head jerked toward her. Its eyes, or what Rachel could only assume were its eyes, glowed with an unnatural, fiery intensity. The room seemed to darken even further, as though the very air was being sucked into the shadow. She wanted to scream, to run, but her voice was trapped in her throat, and her legs felt like lead. A whisper, faint but clear, cut through the silence, its voice a guttural rasp. "Leaf?" Rachel's chest tightened, the pressure in the room unbearable. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Her hand found the door frame, her grip shaking, as if the room itself was trying to pull her back in. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Leave! Now!" The floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble. Rachel could feel the vibrations crawl up her legs, her whole body reacting to the force. She could taste the bitter, metallic tang of fear in her mouth. Something inside her told her that if she stayed, if she didn't leave now, she wouldn't survive whatever this was. The shadow. It wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was real. It was something ancient. Something that had claimed this space, and it was angry. With everything she had left, Rachel turned and bolted for the door, her breath ragged in her chest. Her body screamed for escape, her heart pounding in her ears. She grabbed her keys from the counter, almost dropping them as her fingers fumbled with the cold metal. But before she could reach the front door, she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder, dragging her back. The pressure was unyielding, like iron fingers around her, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She turned around, panic flooding her veins, but no one was there. Only the shadow. It was closer now, hovering just inches from her. The eyes, it had no visible face, but the eyes were burning, malevolent. They pulled at her, as if they could see straight through her soul. "Please," Rachel whispered, the fear overwhelming her. "What do you want from me?" The shadow's shape seemed to distort, its limbs stretching unnaturally long as it reached out to her. and then in a voice colder than death itself, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The figure surged forward, a mass of darkness swallowing the light around her. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as everything went black. Rachel woke up with a start, gasping for breath. Her chest heaved as she struggled to push herself up from the cold wooden floor. She blinked rapidly, disoriented, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The apartment was silent again, too silent. The air felt heavy, thick, suffocating, as if the world around her had been frozen in time. She glanced around in panic, her eyes wide, but the room was normal. The shadows were just shadows. The corner where the figure had been was empty. The oppressive, dark energy that had filled the room moments ago seemed to have vanished, leaving only the quiet hum of the building's old pipes in the walls. Rachel's head spun as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a nightmare? A hallucination? Her mind grasped for any rational explanation, but the memory of those glowing eyes, the cold grip on her shoulder, was too real. It was not a dream. It had been real. And it was still here, somewhere. Frantically, she checked the time. It was nearly 3 a.m., but the hours seemed to have slipped away in a blur, as if the night had stretched on forever. Every inch of her body screamed for escape, for safety, for anything but to stay in that apartment a moment longer. The oppressive silence felt wrong, unnatural. Without thinking, Rachel grabbed her coat and ran out the door, slamming it behind her. She raced down the hallway, hearing nothing but the echo of her hurried footsteps against the old wood and tile. The stairwell was just ahead, dimly lit, the kind of place that made your skin crawl, even in daylight. The building's front door creaked as she pushed it open, the cool night air hitting her like a slap in the face. She didn't look back, didn't even slow down. She ran down the street, her heart still pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't care where she went as long as it was far away from that apartment, far away from whatever was waiting there. It wasn't until she reached a small park a few blocks away that she stopped, bending over to catch her breath. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the cool air helped calm her nerves. But something inside her told her that the worst wasn't over. Rachel pulled out her phone, her hands trembling, and called a friend. She needed someone, anyone. But as the phone rang, she felt it again, the weight of being watched, the sense that something was behind her, lingering, waiting for the right moment to strike. The call went to voicemail. "Please, pick up," Rachel whispered, barely audible through the knot of panic in her throat. She turned around, her eyes scanning the empty streets, but there was nothing there. Nothing but shadows stretching across the pavement, dancing in the dim light, and then, in the farthest corner of her vision, she saw it, the shadow, creeping toward her from the edge of the park. The same shape, the same cold presence. It was waiting just outside the light, stretching and twisting as if it could not fully take form, like a predator toying with its prey. Rachel's blood ran cold. She could feel the pressure of the figure's gaze, even if it didn't have a face. She turned, running as fast as her legs could carry her, but the shadow was closer now, closing the distance between them with unnatural speed. Her pulse raced, the sounds of her footsteps drowned out by the ringing in her ears. The shadow surged forward, a dark mass enveloping her vision. She could feel it closing in, its icy tendrils creeping into her soul, suffocating her. But then, nothing. The ground beneath her feet disappeared, and she collapsed into nothingness. It was a cold October night when Mia first heard the voice. The wind outside howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse. Inside, the fireplace crackled, its orange glow the only warmth in the dim room. Mia sat alone in her living room, a book in her lap, but her mind was elsewhere. The house, despite its charm, had always felt off. She couldn't quite explain it. Perhaps it was the creaking floorboards or the dark corners that seemed to loom a little too long. But tonight, that uneasy feeling was stronger than usual. It was just past midnight when she first heard the whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, the sound carrying through the cracks in the walls. But as she strained her ears, she realized the voice was clear. too clear. It wasn't the wind at all. The voice was soft, guttural, almost a murmur. "Help me." Mia froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if she had heard it correctly, but she was certain. The voice had come from the hallway outside the living room. Slowly she stood up, setting her book aside. She walked toward the door, her breath shallow, her mind racing with questions. Who could it be? The house was isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor. Her family had only recently moved in, and Mia hadn't seen anyone outside for days. The only living creatures around were the wind, the birds, and the occasional deer. No one had come to visit. No one had knocked at the door. She stepped into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The house felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. The darkness seemed to stretch unnaturally far ahead, and the soft whisper came again, "Help me." It was clearer now, almost as if it were directly in front of her. But when she looked around, there was no one. Her breath caught in her throat. The hallway was empty, the air thick with silence, broken only by the distant crackle of the fire in the living room. She turned back toward the door to the kitchen, convinced she had imagined the sound. But then she heard it again, this time louder, more urgent. "Help me, now!" Her pulse quickened. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was trying to reach her. The fear crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching across her thoughts. Mia's instinct screamed at her to leave, to grab her coat and run out into the night, but her feet stayed rooted to the floor. She couldn't explain it, but some part of her felt compelled to follow the voice. With trembling hands, she reached out for the light switch. The click of the switch echoed in the hallway, but the light it cast seemed too weak, as though it couldn't quite banish the darkness around her. That's when she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near the stairs, a figure stood. Tall, thin, with its back to her. The figure was clothed in what appeared to be a long, dark coat, its features hidden by the shadows. Mia's breath hitched. Was it a person or something else? Her feet moved forward without her consent, drawn toward the figure. The whisper came again, this time sounding like a plea. "Please, help me." Mia's hand reached for the figure's shoulder, but before she could touch it, the figure turned around sharply, revealing a face that made Mia's blood run cold. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, but his face was wrong, too pale, too gaunt. His eyes were wide open, but they were dark, empty voids, as if there was nothing inside. His mouth stretched into a horrific grin, but it wasn't a smile. It was a mockery, a grimace of something far darker. The man's skin was almost translucent, like the very essence of life had drained from his body. Help me?" the man whispered again, his voice now rasping, almost a growl. Mia's heart slammed against her chest, her feet suddenly frozen in place. She couldn't tear her eyes away from his empty gaze. The air around them grew heavier, thick with dread, and the temperature seemed to plummet further, frost creeping up the walls. "Who are you?" Mia finally managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. The man's grin widened, impossibly so, his jaw cracking with the effort. His head tilted slightly to one side, and his hollow eyes locked onto hers. "I've been waiting for you." Mia's legs trembled, but she stood her ground. The man, or whatever he was, did not move, but his presence seemed to fill the entire hallway, an oppressive weight pressing against her chest. His hollow eyes never left her, and that grotesque grin remained plastered on his face, stretching wider with every passing second. Her throat went dry, and her mind raced to make sense of what was happening. Was this some twisted trick of the light? A hallucination? But the cold in the air was real. The palpable dread was real. And the man, he was real. I don't understand," Mia whispered, her voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The figure took a slow step toward her, and as he moved, the shadows around him seemed to bend and distort. His feet didn't make a sound against the floor, as if he wasn't fully tethered to the world. Mia instinctively took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. "No, me." The whisper came again, but this time it was laced with something darker, a hint of malice hidden beneath the desperate plea. The man's smile faded just a little, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. "You can't leave until you understand." Mia's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the temperature drop even further, her skin pricking with cold. The whispers in the air seemed to curl around her, closing in, suffocating. Her thoughts were spiraling. What was this thing, and why did she feel as though she knew it from somewhere? "Who are you?" she demanded, more forcefully this time. "Tell me what you want." The man's grin returned, but this time it was laced with something far more sinister. His voice rasped, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "I've been waiting for you for years. You never should have come here. You should have stayed away." Mia recoiled as his words sank in. The fear that had been creeping beneath her skin now exploded in full force. She had never seen this man before, so why did he speak as if he knew her? The farmhouse. It had always felt like something was wrong, but she had ignored the feelings, chalking them up to the isolation of the old house. Its creaks and groans were all just part of the charm of living in the countryside, but now, with this figure in front of her, everything was different. She could feel it deep in her bones. This house had a history, and it was a history she was now a part of. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice strained. "Why me?" The man's dark eyes flickered for a moment, his lips trembling as though he were about to speak. But instead of words, a vision flashed in front of Mia's eyes, broken images that made no sense at first. A field, a funeral procession, a coffin being lowered into the ground. The vision was gone as quickly as it came, but the impact was overwhelming. Mia stumbled back, gasping for air. What had she just seen? Who had died? The man spoke once more, his voice now a low growl. "The house chose you, Mia. You are part of the story now. There's no escaping it." Mia's eyes widened, the truth hitting her like a slap to the face. She had never known the full history of the house, only that it was old, abandoned for decades before her family had moved in. But now, it felt as if something was trying to push its way through to her, something ancient and wrong. The man's smile twisted, and he stepped closer, his movement like liquid darkness, his eyes gleaming with hunger. "You're here for a reason, and you will learn what happens when you don't leave." Mia's heart raced in her chest as the man's words settled over her like a dark cloud. She had to get away, but her feet felt frozen to the floor, rooted by a force she couldn't understand. The house, this house, held its secrets in the walls, in the shadows. And now it seemed to be pulling her into something she didn't want to face. But in her heart, she knew it. She had reached a place where her white blood was. The man took another slow step forward, his presence growing more oppressive with each movement. His pale face seemed to flicker like a candle in the wind, his smile widening with cruel anticipation. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she tried to back away, but the weight of the air around her seemed to press in from all sides. "You think you can escape?" The man's voice was a rasp, the words dripping with contempt. "You think you can leave?" Mia shook her head, trying to push the words from her mind. She wanted to run. She needed to run. But something in the air held her captive. Something inside her told her she needed to know more. This wasn't just about getting away. It was about understanding. It was about finding out the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. "What do you want from me?" she asked again, her voice hoarse, her resolve crumbling. "Why me?" The man's grin faded, replaced by a twisted, sorrowful look that sent a chill straight through her spine. His voice dropped to a whisper, almost tender as he spoke again. "Because this house, it chose you. It always chooses someone. You're part of its story." Mia's stomach twisted with dread, the feeling that had been gnawing at her for days. This house had never felt right. She had dismissed it, told herself it was just her imagination. But now, the truth was becoming clear. The house had a history, a dark history, and she was trapped in it. The man continued, his voice growing more urgent. This house was built on blood, built on lies, built on death, and once it has you, it never lets go. Suddenly, a flood of images burst into Mia's mind, too fast to comprehend. Flashing scenes of violence, of menacing figures, of dark rituals in the shadows. A sacrifice, a burning, anguished face. Mia's head spun as the visions overwhelmed her, the memories, some of them not her own, flooding her thoughts. Then, in the midst of the chaos, one image stood out. A young woman, her face twisted in pain, her body limp in the arms of the man standing before her. The man, the figure before Mia, the man in the hallway laughed softly, a sound that echoed through the house, sending vibrations through the walls. She thought she could leave too, he said, his voice dripping with dark amusement. But once you're marked, Mia, there's no escape. You will never leave this place. Mia's breath hitched as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The young woman, the one in the vision, had been someone like her. Someone who had lived in this house. Someone who had tried to leave but couldn't. Her death was the price of her escape. And now Mia was bound by the same curse. She was the next one. The next victim. You don't have to do this, Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Please, tell me how to break it. The man's eyes glinted with malicious satisfaction. You can't break it, he said, his voice low and gravelly. You can only endure it. He raised his hand, a pale, trembling finger pointing toward the far wall. Mia turned, her gaze following his finger, and what she saw nearly made her heart stop. On the wall was an old, cracked mirror, its surface dark and murky. But as she looked into it, the reflection was not her own. Instead, it was a vision, a woman, her face pale, eyes hollow and filled with torment. Mia gasped, stepping back as the woman in the reflection slowly raised her head and locked eyes with her. It was the same face from the vision. The woman who had been here before, the woman who had died. The reflection mouthed something, its lips twisting in silent agony. Help me, the whisper echoed in Mia's mind, blending with the cold voice of the man behind her. You're not the first, he said. You won't be the last. Mia's body trembled as the world around her seemed to twist and distort. The darkness in the corners of the hallway stretched, pulling at her, trying to swallow her whole. The man's laughter rose again, harsh and mocking. And then she heard it, the whisper, soft, chilling, and unmistakable. Help me now. Mia's heart raced as the world around her began to close in. The whisper, growing louder and more frantic, echoed in her mind like a pounding drum. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The man's presence was suffocating, his twisted grin still plastered on his face as he loomed behind her, his pale, cold fingers brushing against the air. Help me? The voice begged again. It was no longer coming from the reflection, but from every corner of the house, from the walls themselves. Mia could feel the house alive with hunger, a deep, gnawing hunger that had claimed everyone who had ever lived here. Mia's knees buckled and she stumbled forward, her hands pressed to her ears as she tried to block out the haunting voices. She needed to leave. She needed to escape. But how? The door, the one that had seemed like an exit, now felt like a trap. She could feel the weight of the house pressing in from all sides, trapping her in its claustrophobic grip. The man's laugh rang out once more, sending a chill down her spine. There's no escape, he whispered, his voice dripping with cruel certainty. You're here now. You belong to the house. But Mia, she couldn't let this be her fate. She refused to be another lost soul, another victim of this twisted history. Her mind was racing, her thoughts flying in all directions. The vision of the woman, the one who had tried to leave, kept flashing in her mind. She had died here, yes, but not because she had given up. She had fought. She had fought to the very end, and so would Mia. The air was thick with a supernatural force that seemed to tangle with her every move, but Mia wasn't going down without a fight. She forced herself to focus on the reflection in the mirror. That woman, the one who had suffered here before her, her eyes had begged for help. It wasn't just a cry for pity. It was a plea for Mia to break free, to do what she had failed to do, to escape. Mia turned and faced the man. His grin never wavered, but there was something different in his eyes. For the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt. For the first time, he looked less like an unkillable force and more like a fragile, twisted reflection of what he had once been. She took a step forward, then another, and another. "I won't be your victim," Mia said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "You won't win." The man tilted his head, his smile curling into something darker. "You really think you can escape?" Mia's eyes flicked to the door once again. Her legs trembled with fear, but she moved. She had to move. Each step was like a battle, the walls closing in, the whispers growing louder, the house pushing against her with every ounce of its sinister power. But she wasn't going to give in. Not now, not ever. In one swift motion, she reached the door. Her fingers wrapped around the handle, and with all her strength, she yanked it open. The cold air rushed in, biting at her skin, but it didn't matter. She was free. The man's scream echoed from the shadows, a furious, hollow sound that chased her as she ran. But Mia didn't look back. She didn't stop. Her legs carried her faster than she ever thought possible, her heart pounding in her chest, the fear still clinging to her like a second skin. The house loomed behind her, but with every step, the oppressive weight lifted. The whispers faded into the distance, becoming nothing more than a haunting memory. Mia ran through the darkened night, not daring to stop until she was far away, until the house was nothing more than a silhouette in the distance. She had escaped, but as Mia collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, a single thought gnawed at her. What if the house hadn't let her go? What if, just like the woman before her, she would be forced to return one day? And as she looked over her shoulder one last time, she swore she saw a shadow standing at the window, watching her, waiting. The whisper came again, soft but unmistakable. "You're never truly free." Samantha had never been fond of her new house. Sure, it was spacious, beautiful, and full of character, but there was something off about it. The way the floorboards creaked at night, the feeling that something or someone was watching her from just out of sight. When she first moved in, everything seemed fine. It was a fixer-upper, an old Victorian house in a quiet neighborhood, and she'd been eager to make it her own. The real estate agent had been eager to sell, assuring her that the house was full of history, but Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that it was full of something else, something darker. It all started when she noticed the attic door. It was small, tucked away in the corner of the hallway, hidden behind a faded tapestry. She had passed it by countless times without a second thought. But one night, when she was alone, something drew her toward it. The door was cracked open just slightly, as if inviting her in. Curiosity got the best of her, and she pushed it open. The stairs creaked under her weight as she ascended, the air thick with dust. As she reached the top, a cold chill wrapped around her. The attic was larger than she expected, filled with boxes, old furniture, and forgotten treasures. But there was something else, something more sinister, that Samantha couldn't quite put her finger on. It was a presence, lingering in the air. She felt it pressing against her skin, her breath catching in her throat. She hesitated, but then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper. "Samantha?" The voice was faint, almost like it was carried on the wind. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It came again, clearer this time, a woman's voice, raspy and broken. "Help me!" Samantha's blood ran cold. She turned quickly, scanning the attic. There was no one there, no sign of anyone. Just the cluttered mess of forgotten items, untouched for years. Her pulse raced as she backed away from the attic, quickly closing the door behind her. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling remained. The house was trying to tell her something, and she had a sinking feeling that she wasn't the first to hear it. The next few days were a blur of unsettling feelings. Samantha couldn't shake the incident in the attic, the whisper, the chilling presence. It was all too vivid in her mind. Each time she passed by the door to the attic, a heavy weight seemed to settle in her chest. But she tried to dismiss it. She had to believe there was no rational explanation. Old houses were creaky, drafty. It could have been the wind or her imagination. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. It wasn't until she returned home late one evening that the unease returned full force. She had been out with a friend, trying to push the unsettling thoughts away, but as she unlocked the door, she felt a shiver run up her spine. The air inside was thick, and the house seemed quieter than usual. Too quiet. As she stepped inside, she immediately noticed something odd. The attic door was wide open. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't opened it when she left, and there was no way the wind could have caused it to swing open like that. She froze, staring at the staircase leading up into the darkness. The air seemed colder now, the shadows longer, as if something was watching her from the top. Instinctively, Samantha reached for the phone in her pocket, her fingers trembling. She wanted to call someone, anyone, but the words wouldn't come. Something in her gut told her that this was something she had to face alone. With slow, deliberate steps, she ascended the stairs once more, the old wood creaking beneath her weight. The higher she climbed, the more oppressive the silence became. And then, as she reached the top, it happened again. The whisper. This time it was louder, more urgent, almost like a plea. "Help me!" Samantha's breath hitched. She scanned the attic, her eyes flicking from one dark corner to the next. The room seemed to stretch before her, the shadows deepening with each passing second. And then, in the farthest corner of the attic, she saw it. A figure. A woman sitting on the ground, her back hunched, her face obscured by her long, dark hair. Samantha's pulse quickened. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond. She remained motionless, her head bowed as if lost in her own sorrow. The air grew even colder, and Samantha felt a sharp prickling on the back of her neck as though someone or something was standing just behind her. She took a cautious step forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, without warning, the woman lifted her head. Samantha stumbled backward, her heart slamming against her chest. The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide and filled with an emptiness that sent a wave of terror crashing over her. Her skin was stretched tight over her bones as if she hadn't eaten in years. The woman's lips parted, revealing a gaping hole where her teeth should have been. The air grew even colder, a frigid breeze swirling around Samantha as the woman spoke, her voice raspy and broken. "Help me, please." Samantha backed away, her legs shaking with fear. She was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, unable to move. The woman's gaze never left her, her eyes boring into Samantha's soul, pleading for something that Samantha couldn't understand. And then, as if in response to the unspoken question in Samantha's mind, the woman opened her mouth once more. They killed me." Samantha's blood ran cold. She didn't understand. The words didn't make sense. "Who killed you?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and confusion. The woman's head tilted slightly to the side, her hollow eyes staring into Samantha's with a look of desperation. "The family, the ones who lived here before you." Before Samantha could respond, the woman's figure began to fade into the shadows, her form dissolving into the darkness of the attic. "Find me, help me," the woman's voice echoed, now distant, fading away like a ghost lost in time. Samantha stood frozen in the dim light, heart pounding. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread and sadness wash over her. She had to know more. The woman had spoken of a family, a history, something dark tied to the house. But how could she uncover the truth without losing herself in the same darkness? Samantha couldn't ignore what had happened in the attic. The woman, her hollow eyes, her desperate plea, haunted her thoughts, filling her dreams with images of the forgotten soul, stuck in the house, waiting for someone to set her free. It wasn't just an encounter, it was a warning, a message. But what was the woman trying to tell her? Why had she been killed? And why had no one else ever mentioned the strange history of the house? And the next morning, Samantha decided to confront the truth. She spent hours searching through old records, newspapers, anything she could find about the house's past. Most of the neighbors didn't seem to know much beyond the usual gossip, but as she dug deeper into the local archives, she found a disturbing article buried under layers of dust. The headline read, "Local family vanishes without a trace. Authorities baffled." They had lost real estate within years before the state got rid of it. It was dated over 30 years ago. The article detailed the disappearance of a family that had once lived in the house, Mr. and Mrs. Hawkins and their 2 young children. The family had seemed normal, well liked by the community. They had lived in the house for years, but one day, they simply vanished. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of foul play. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air, leaving no trace behind. The article spoke of strange occurrences surrounding the family, though. People in the neighborhood had reported hearing odd noises late at night, whispers, cries, and even the sound of footsteps when no one was around. A few weeks before they disappeared, some neighbors claimed to have seen a figure standing in the attic window, watching them. But when they went to investigate, the house was always empty. Samantha felt a shiver crawl up her spine as she read the last line of the article. "Some believe the house is cursed, and that the spirits of those who lived there before have never truly left." Cursed, the word echoed in her mind. The missing family, the whispers, the woman in the attic. It all made sense now. The woman wasn't just some random spirit. She was one of the Hawkins family, the last one to disappear. She had been left behind, her soul trapped within the walls of the house, unable to find peace. Samantha's pulse quickened. She had to find a way to help her. She couldn't leave the woman to suffer forever, nor could she ignore the growing fear that was slowly suffocating her. That night, Samantha returned to the attic. She was determined to make contact with the woman again, to understand what had happened and how she could help. This time, she wasn't going to let fear control her. She was going to get answers. As she reached the top of the stairs, the cold air greeted her once again, a heavy silence hanging in the room. The attic felt different now, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in around her. And then, there it was again, the whisper. "Help me!" Samantha's heart raced, but she stood firm. "I'm here," she called out into the darkness. "I'm here to help you." The shadows seemed to shift in response. Slowly, the figure of the woman began to materialize before her, her gaunt face, pale and distorted, appearing out of the gloom. She was standing in the same spot, just as she had before, but there was something different about her this time. Her eyes were no longer empty. They were full of rage, sorrow, and fear. She stepped closer, her form flickering in and out of focus. "Please, you have to stop them," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "They can't be allowed to take another." The words hit Samantha like a wave, and before she could speak, the woman's form began to dissolve, her image warping into a blur of darkness. Samantha reached out in desperation, her breath catching in her throat. Who are you talking about?" she cried, her voice shaking with fear and confusion. The woman's face appeared one last time, her eyes wide with terror. And in that final moment, she spoke her last words. "The house. It's not done. It needs more." And then she was gone. Samantha stood in the attic alone, her mind reeling. The woman's words lingered in the air like a dark omen, hanging over her like a cloud. The house isn't done. It needs more. What did that mean? Was the house hungry for more souls? Was that what had happened to the House family? Had they been consumed, and now the house was calling for her, pulling her into its grasp? The more Samantha thought about it, the more she realized she had to leave. The woman's warning was clear. The house wasn't finished with her. She wasn't just living in a home, she was living in a prison, surrounded by the souls of the past, still trapped by the horrors that had occurred. But no matter how much she wanted to run, there was something that kept her rooted to the spot. Was the woman's plea for help a warning for Samantha, Or was it a final request to end her own torment? She didn't have time to think any further. The house was waiting, and so was the woman. Samantha couldn't leave, not yet. The woman's final plea echoed in her mind. The house isn't done. It needs more. It was a warning, she realized. A warning of something much darker than she had ever anticipated. The house wasn't just cursed. It was alive, feeding off the souls of its past inhabitants. And now it seemed to want her. Her pulse quickened as she paced the attic, trying to make sense of it all. Her hands trembled, and she fought the urge to run. The air was thick with a foreboding presence, as though something invisible was closing in on her, suffocating her with its weight. It was clear that the house had claimed the Hawkins family, but had it also claimed others before them? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the strange occurrences in the house, her restless nights, the whispers in the dark, the feeling of being watched, were all signs of its hunger. The house had a pattern, a cycle that repeated itself, drawing in new residents like her, feeding off their fear and torment until it had taken everything. Samantha knew she had to break the cycle. If she didn't, she would become just another lost soul, another forgotten memory in the house's dark history. With renewed resolve, she descended the stairs, her mind racing with ideas. She needed to confront the house itself. But how? How could she stop something so powerful, something that had already claimed so many? She made her way to the living room, where she had seen the old fireplace earlier. There had to be something hidden there, something that could break the house's grip on her. As she knelt in front of the fireplace, the sound of soft footsteps echoed through the house. Samantha froze, her heart pounding. "Is it fair?" Max asked. "Is it fair?" No, I wasn't lying. She wasn't alone. The woman appeared before her, her form flickering in and out of existence as though she were a ghost caught between worlds. Her face was pale and drawn, her hollow eyes filled with anguish. But there was something different about her now. She wasn't angry. She wasn't seeking vengeance. She was simply lost, a soul that had been trapped for far too long. Samantha didn't speak this time. She just looked into the woman's eyes, hoping to find some answer. The woman tilted her head slightly as though understanding the silent question, and then, with a whisper that sent chills down Samantha's spine, she spoke. "You have to burn it. Destroy the house. Only fire can set us free." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. Burn it? Destroy it? Could she really do that? Could she truly destroy the place that had been her home for so long, even though it had become a prison? But the more she thought about it, the clearer the answer became. The house had to be purged. The curse, the hunger, it would never end unless she took that final step. There was no other way to break the cycle. Without another word, Samantha stood up, her hands shaking as she moved toward the fireplace. She grabbed the matches she had found earlier and struck one, the flame dancing in the dark room. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, but the woman's pleading gaze gave her the strength she needed. "Goodbye," Samantha whispered, more to herself than to the woman. Then she dropped the match onto the pile of old papers and kindlings she had gathered earlier. The flames flickered to life instantly, growing higher and higher, filling the room with warmth and light. Samantha stepped back, watching as the fire crackled and consumed everything in its path. The air in the room grew thick with smoke, but it wasn't just the fire that made her choke. It was the oppressive presence that had hung over the house, lifting, dissipating as the flames grew stronger. The woman appeared one last time, her figure now glowing in the flickering light of the fire. She smiled, a small, sad smile, before slowly fading away. The air in the room felt lighter, as though the weight that had once crushed Samantha's spirit had been lifted. The house groaned as the fire spread, its wooden beams creaking and splintering. And then, with a final thunderous crack, the house collapsed in on itself, the flames roaring in triumph as they consumed everything. Samantha stood outside, watching the house burn to the ground, the night air cool against her skin. The smoke rose into the sky, and for the first time in weeks, she felt at peace. The house was gone, the curse was broken. The woman, the Hawkins family, all the lost souls trapped inside, finally freed. Samantha turned away, the sounds of the fire fading behind her. It was over. But as she walked away from the ruins of the house, she couldn't help but wonder. Was the darkness truly gone, or had it simply found another place to hide, waiting for its next victim? Rachel had always been a light sleeper. Since childhood, she'd had a particular fear of being alone in the dark. It wasn't the monsters under the bed or the creepy crawlies in the closet. It was the feeling of being watched, of someone or something lurking just beyond the reach of her vision. Her new apartment had seemed perfect at first. A cozy one-bedroom unit on the edge of town, affordable and just close enough to her work to make the daily commute bearable. But after moving in, something felt off. It was subtle at first, a flickering light, a creak in the floorboards at night, but soon Rachel began to feel the heavy weight of a presence, just out of sight, watching her as she slept. It started with the shadows. Every time Rachel turned off the lights and settled into bed, she would see something. At first, it was a fleeting movement, the kind of thing you think is just your eyes playing tricks on you. But then it became more distinct. Shadows, dark, slithering shapes, would appear at the edge of her bed. At first, they were small, just a flicker of movement near the foot of her bed. But as the days passed, they grew larger, more defined. One night, after a long day at work, Rachel decided to confront the strange occurrence. She sat up in bed, the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the room. Her heart raced as she focused on the corner where the shadows seemed to gather. And then it happened. A dark shape, long and thin, slowly crept out from beneath her bed. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the shape began to move, inching its way toward her. She could see no features, no face, just the silhouette of something unnatural, a shifting form that had no place in the world. She didn't dare move, paralyzed by fear. Her eyes locked onto the shadow as it seemed to grow larger and closer, its presence suffocating her. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room fell into an unnatural silence, and Rachel's pulse slowed, though her mind raced with questions. What had she seen? Was it just her imagination, or was there something truly sinister lurking beneath her bed? The next few days felt like a blur of unease. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her every moment. Her mind replayed the image of that shadow, and she grew more exhausted from the sleepless nights. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the shadows cast by the trees outside her window, or perhaps there was a logical explanation. But nothing seemed to make sense. One evening she called her best friend Claire, hoping to distract herself from her growing paranoia. They talked for a while, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The moment Claire hung up, she heard a faint sound, like something brushing against the floor. Rachel froze, her blood running cold. She hesitated for a moment, then stood up and walked slowly toward the sound. Her breath caught in her throat as she glanced toward the edge of the bed, her eyes scanning the shadows. It was there again. A long, dark shape was creeping from under the bed, moving just out of her direct line of sight. This time it was closer, more distinct. The air grew thick with a suffocating presence, as though the very walls of the room were closing in around her. Without thinking, Rachel grabbed the nearest object, an old wooden chair, and threw it across the room, hoping to disrupt whatever was there. The shadow disappeared with a hiss, vanishing into the corner of the room. She stood there, trembling, trying to catch her breath, her heart racing in her chest. That night she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the shape, lurking beneath her bed, waiting for her to let her guard down. She could feel its presence, cold and malevolent, just beyond the edge of her awareness. In the morning, she decided to do what she should have done from the beginning: investigate. She crawled under her bed, heart pounding in her chest as she peered into the darkness. She half expected something to jump out at her, but there was nothing, just dust and old boxes that had accumulated over time. Relieved but still shaken, she convinced herself it had all been in her head. But as she lay back in bed, exhaustion pulling her under, she couldn't help but wonder, what if the shadow wasn't something in her mind at all? What if it was something far more real, something far more dangerous? Rachel had never been a superstitious person. She didn't believe in ghosts or hauntings, but the events of the past few weeks had shaken her to the core. She couldn't deny what she had seen, what she had felt. And she was beginning to feel as though the shadows weren't just shadows at all. One night, after a particularly long day, she finally succumbed to the exhaustion. Her body ached for rest, and her mind had reached its breaking point. She lay down, closing her eyes, hoping for some peace. But sleep didn't come easily. The shadows, the strange shapes, danced behind her eyelids, and the sensation of being watched never left her. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept across her skin, and she bolted upright in bed. The room was ice cold, even though it was the middle of summer. Her eyes shot to the corner of the room, and that's when she saw it. The shadow was back. It wasn't just beneath the bed now. It had grown, stretching up the walls, coiling around the furniture like a living thing. The air was thick with dread, and Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as the shadow seemed to form into something more tangible, a long, elongated figure, dark and featureless. She couldn't move. The fear paralyzed her as the shadow inched closer, its presence suffocating. And then, with a voice that wasn't hers, a voice cold and ancient, it spoke. "You shouldn't have stayed," Rachel gasped, the words cutting through her like ice. Her blood ran cold, and she realized with a sickening certainty that the shadow wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was something ancient, something malevolent that had been waiting for her. As the figure advanced toward her, its shadowy tendrils stretching out like claws, Rachel finally broke free from her paralysis. She screamed and bolted for the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't look back as she fled the apartment, the echoes of the voice chasing her into the night. Rachel never returned to the apartment. She couldn't. Her once peaceful, quiet home had become a nightmare, and the shadows still haunted her dreams. She moved in with Claire, telling herself that it was over. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had escaped the apartment, but the shadow hadn't been left behind. Weeks passed, and Rachel tried to move on. But the dark presence followed her, lurking at the edges of her consciousness. The shadows were still there, waiting, and every time she closed her eyes to sleep, she could feel them growing closer, inch by inch. One night, as Rachel lay in bed, she heard it again, the soft brush of something moving across the floor. Slowly, she turned her head, and there it was, a dark, creeping shape beneath the bed. The shadows had come to claim her.